Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Eve Fairbanks, who is here with her brand new book, The Inheritors, an intimate portrait of South Africa's racial reckoning. She'll be in conversation with Dana Milbank. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-growing digital community. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Throughout the summer, we have a selection of in-person and virtual events, and things will really ramp up again in September. Our calendar appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I'll drop links in the chat to order The Inheritors. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever, support of the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event will include some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable the captions yourself by clicking on the Closed Caption Live Transcript button on your screen. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past couple of years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Eve Fairbanks is an essayist and reporter whose writing is focused on change in cities, countries, landscapes, morals, values, and even in our ideas of ourselves. A former political writer for the New Republic, her essays and reportage have been published in the Washington Post, The Guardian, and the New York Times, among others. Born in Virginia, she now lives in Johannesburg, South Africa. The Inheritors is her debut. She'll be in conversation this evening with Dana Milbank, who is a longtime op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. You may also be familiar with him for the political commentary he provides for TV outlets, as well as his 3 books, including the national bestseller Homo Politicus. His new book, The Destructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party, is out next month. What happens when the world you know and all the rules you've been taught to follow suddenly change? In April 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa, marking the end of decades of legally recognized segregation and explicit white supremacy. The Inheritors, Eve's new book, follows the stories of 3 people who lived through it. The book is about change on a national and personal level, exploring the intersection of race, power, and history. Book page raves. The Inheritors covers a lot of ground, capturing Black heroes like Nelson Mandela and Steve Biko, as well as castigated white politicians like Frederick Willem de Klerk. She also examines how the rest of the world has handled racism and colonialism before and after 1994, including the ongoing turmoil in 21st century America. Glimmering throughout is the humanity she manages to find in all of it. There are lessons here for readers the world over, especially as South Africa joins the global marketplace and the US continues to grapple with the human cost of racism. Fairbanks compels us to pay attention, learn, and above all, care. And the New York Times says Fairbanks' empathetic, comprehensive reporting shines when she tells it straight, providing insight into how ordinary people build lives in the aftermath of political upheaval. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. The digital podium is yours, Eve and Dana. I'll bring you right up on screen.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Claire. It's good to be with you all this evening. Now, I've known Eve Fairbanks for many years. We had a shared background at the New Republic, but I knew her in a very different journalistic capacity. It was sort of a hard-bitten reporter covering American politics. Now here, in this beautifully written book, she tells the story of South Africa's apartheid and its post-apartheid history with nuance and tenderness. Now, these are not traits often found in your hard-bitten Washington correspondent. And along the way, she developed deep relationships with South Africans of all walks of life, and she develops these portraits through the book in really a lyrical style. I think it works so well for an American audience because while it's a story of South Africa, it's also a story about us. South Africa overnight became what the United States is becoming over many decades as whites lose their political dominance. So I thought maybe we could start off with Eve giving us a bit of an overview of the book. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion and bring in whatever questions you have. So Eve, please kick us off.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Harvard Bookstore for having both of us. I'm going to quickly try to share my screen with you guys. I hope that nothing weird is going to show up. In order to just give you a little bit of a kind of a glimpse of what's in the book, the kind of stories that are in there and the central issues that it talks about. It is a piece of narrative reportage that I did over actually about 12 years living in South Africa that talks about the experiences of many people that I knew and that I developed relationships with, in some cases by interviewing them for a smaller story and then just realizing that I wanted to talk to them at great length. And in some cases, they were people that I went back to ask them if they would spend a lot more time with me after just realizing that I couldn't stop thinking about little things that they had told me about the situation that Dana just described. So let me attempt to share. Sorry, hang on one second. If this doesn't work, then I'll just talk without this photograph. All right. I think maybe because this is not a private Zoom, it doesn't want me to share something crazy with you guys. So I'm just gonna describe, fair enough. What I wanted to show you was a very iconic photograph that was taken by a Time magazine photographer in 1993. And it depicts Nelson Mandela, and you can really recognize him even from the back of his head. He was just such a famous figure by that point. And it was 3 years out of him being released from prison, where he'd been basically unseen for 27 years as a political prisoner of the white apartheid regime. And he is speaking to a group of 15-year-old boys at a 100-year-old, historically all white, fancy boarding school in Johannesburg. And you've got them in their blue jackets with their crests looking very Eton-y or Andover-y. And then there's just a couple of the first Black students who were basically allowed into that school or effectively forced into it who are also in the crowd. And the reason that the picture became iconic, and it's been reprinted a million times and sort of analyzed, is because the boys who are like expected to come of age in one kind of country and suddenly are like facing themselves having an adulthood in a totally different one, or their faces are like this and kind of grimacing, and like if they would be checking their phones, if they could be checking their phones, they would be. It wasn't that time. And you see these beautiful smiles on the faces of like the 2 or 3 Black boys who are in this audience. And I remember when I first came across this photograph, what I loved about it is that it was just so powerful, and it seemed to convey so much that we might expect. But it's actually a very misleading photograph in a way that I think is interesting, and that kind of illuminates some of why I took so long to write this book and bring these accounts of South Africa forward. So, it's this very iconic picture of Mandela preaching, speaking whatever he's speaking. He had his reconciliatory attitude before the sons, basically, of the former power brokers who had suddenly been deposed, and they're still in their kind of regalia of authority. And you have the sense that, we're right on this precipice of this huge change, huge change, which in South Africa, it's a type of change that I think a lot of places are undergoing, which is a change both in the demographic makeup of institutions, of the public square, of intellectual life, of leadership, but also because of that, a kind of reconsideration of how these institutions were designed, what they stand for, what the society's kind of goals even should be as systems. And, you know, they're sort of grimacing and kind of anxious about this. And then you have the Black students who appear very anticipatory. And so I moved to South Africa in 2009, which was 15 years after 1994, which was South Africa's first democratic election, first real democratic election, first inclusive democratic election, which kind of catapulted the country from a state of claiming to be a democracy, but being where the only people who could really vote and really participate and really kind of run it were a 15% minority of the population, to a real democracy that was very suddenly dominated by people of color. I mean, overnight you had the parliament going from being all white to being 70, 80% Black people and Indian, and South Africa is quite diverse. But so this was sort of a kind of astonishing change. And it also, I think, felt like the end of a story that had been very captivating. I'm sure people here remember the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s, the sanctions that foreign countries imposed, and that this kind of miraculously ended with this Truth and Reconciliation Commission and mode of forgiveness. And when I landed in South Africa, I became initially, I was sort of caught by this white minority, partly because it was really kind of a rare situation that they were in. In most other African countries, the colonial rulers, most of them left after Black liberation. But in South Africa, you had this white minority that was to stay on to be governed by people that they had oppressed. And I remember I went out a couple of early weekends to like festivals for the Afrikaans community, which was the Dutch-derived settler group that implemented apartheid starting in the 1950s. And I remember arriving at these sort of parties, festivals, being immediately struck by very strange contradictions in how they visually looked and the identity in them and how people were presenting themselves. Because on the one hand, they were like more Napa than Napa, like every type of organic, bougie, sort of oat, like part slopey Whole Foods type of food stuff would be on display. There were cookbooks, panoplies of them, how you can age your own camembert, how to set up your own smoker, this very kind of high-end hipster type of thing, which really hadn't been present as much under apartheid in that community. It had been under certain pressure to present itself as quite austere, not too rich, because, not too taking advantage of this kind of captive labor pool that it had. And there was just this sort of explosion in the aftermath of a kind of indulging in sometimes very like almost edgy, like hydroponic cannabis and dive bars, and it just that type of thing. And there were a lot of other ways that community presented itself that way. And in a sense, I thought to kind of reaffirm its class. And yet at the exact same time, you you could have just turned your head a tiny bit and thought that you were at the Sturgis motorcycle rally, quite literally. So the whole soundtrack of these sort of festivals was country music, and a type of country that really lionized being very down home, having a beer belly, being trashy and poor, and kind of like, I only have one tractor and it's missing all of its tires and this type of thing, because there was also this countervailing pressure on this group to almost invert its identity into a kind of minority, almost victim class. And this is something that I go into at length in the book, and I think Dana and I will talk about. I wish you could see my photos, but I found these scenes and the combination of them. So in this country, usually those things would not be like all mashed together quite exactly in that way. But, and it made me realize that for a lot of people outside of South Africa, and South Africans will also say this as something really frustrating, their story, as people know it, and even as people use it to make points politically, to give political examples about reconciliation or Mandela, their story kind of ended for some people in 1994. It was like, fantastic, you know, this miraculous thing happened, and let's not look too closely at what happens after that. And there have been a lot of changes in that country, and a lot of ways that people have wrestled with the kind of reemergence of attitudes that they thought that they had put a lid on. You know, formerly progressive white South Africans starting to voice, in some cases, the desire to have a new breakaway all-white state so that they could run themselves again. It's things that were quite unanticipated and kind of shocking. And I think that it's a very archetypal and sort of instructive country for a whole host of people from other places, but especially for Americans who are really, I don't want to be super reductive, but it feels like we're not sure what direction we're going in. But in some sense, there's the sense that an old guard either is or should be losing a grip on power, and that there's a real kind of power inversion that may be happening. So I ended up focusing on three people in particular. And again, as I said, they were people, you know, I met obviously innumerable people in the entire time that I've lived there. I still live in Johannesburg. And I really battled with who I wanted to write about. And I initially tried classical journalistic, maybe even programmatic kind of ways, like let's write about a white reactionary, and let's write about a Black elite, and let's write this in a very tight, true crimey sort of way that's kind of trendy. And I ended up throwing out 3 full drafts of this book. So that's like maybe 400,000 words, because it just, in a way, it wasn't really sitting right. And I finally realized that there were people that I thought about, not as a writer, but as a person, people that I told friends about, you know, can you imagine what this person had to go through, and how they've been facing this sort of new situation. And I ended up just realizing that if if that was what I kept thinking about, that those are the people I should write about. And in one case, it was something that I'd met through interviewing. In another case, it was a friend. And I tried to write about them in quite a poetic way. So you have a member of that white minority as one of the main characters, and he was drafted in the late 80s to fight for the 15% white minority rule, which had a grip on the country. They had an army, I mean, it was the regime's army, and they had a draft, and every white man had to fight in this army. And this army was policing Black neighborhoods. And he struggled so much afterward with the very positive memories that he had of his time in the military, not his time doing the missions, but the discipline, the friends, the bonding, the kind of growing up that by necessity he had to do in it, and the recognition that he had been fighting for an evil cause. And then the two others are Black South Africans. And the last thing I'll say is that the majority of the book covers these two Black South Africans and their lives. One was also coming of age right around 1994, having been an activist fighting against apartheid, and then having effectively gotten the political regime that she wanted in a way that few of us will ever experience in our lives, to just achieve your goal as an activist. And then her daughter, who was born in 1992, so she doesn't have any memories of apartheid itself. And they have also struggled a lot with disappointment, with having to confront what they realized had been a kind of utopian fantasy for what might happen after the end of apartheid, and even with nostalgia, which is very hard for them to talk about, but nostalgia for this period where they had this one mission and this huge cause. So, you know, it really is a place that's still very living, in terms, by which I mean people still are having to live the aftershocks and the returns and the reemergences of something that everybody thought was effectively over, an era of history that was to be put in the past. And that's how I chose to do it. I would say one more thing about this photo, but I'm not going to because I can't show it to you. So yeah, that's a little bit about the book.
All right, terrific. Thank you for that, Eve. So you mentioned that this reemergence of attitudes in South Africa, that they thought they'd put a lid on. And when you said that, I thought there's some place else where such a thing has been occurring, a little bit closer to home. So I wanted to see what you had. You wrote that. That for Americans, that what you've written is a story of what's ahead for us. You said it was like looking at America in a funhouse mirror, at once recognizable and magnified, so I could see its emergent features more clearly. So now that you've had that glimpse, can you come back and tell us what it tells you about how America will change as we approach a white minority status in the coming decades? And of course, not happening overnight here. It's going to happen in, I believe, 2044, and probably the loss of political power will come a decade or two after that. How do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, South Africa has its share of vocal and even influential Trump-like figures, Steve Bannon-like figures, but I would say it also allows us to potentially imagine what a country would look like. So just imagine what it would look like if there were no Trump, if the Republican Party was very small, if these figures like Josh Hawley or whatever, they did not garner so much attention and didn't have so much influence. And obviously, initially, when I would say that, I think there would be a lot of people who might say, thank God, that would be a glory. That would just be the greatest, right? All our problems would be over. But I think what that country has really grappled with is, somebody put it to me that after, and this was a Black government official, after we came into power and we were very dominant in parliament and at universities, where maybe heads of department will now be people of color, we had to grapple with what we wanted, what we ever wanted. And was it to move more freely in the institutions that exist, or was it to radically dismantle them? And that has been a huge conflict within kind of lefty circles and that type of thing in South Africa. So I think that if I were to answer your question briefly, I mean, there's next stages of questioning what it really means to make a more just society and so on, that occur even after certain very vocal kind of people that we could think of now lose power.
Mm-hmm. You write quite a bit. I don't want to say the book is gloomy, because it contains I think an excellent mix of the optimistic and the pessimistic. But I was struck by how you were saying, I think many South Africans, but in particular white South Africans, have a sense of gloom that is kind of unwarranted by the actual situation they're in. You write, in so many material ways, white life remained more or less untouched or had even improved. But even wealthy white South Africans began to radiate a degree of anxiety that didn't match any simple economic analysis of their situation. You use the example of electrical power, all these complaints about outages, which may be true, but back in 1994, only half the populace even had electrical power, and now it covers 90%. You mentioned a similar issue with the complaints about potholes. Why this outsized gloom and anxiety in South Africa? And it again seems to be a bit of a parallel to our own situation here in the United States, where it seems like you were right about to shut the lights out, but it doesn't quite match the actual reality of where we are.
Yeah, there's a feeling in South Africa that things are about to explode or fall apart. And it's true that it is by far the most unequal country on earth. But it reminded me of a certain kind of like apocalyptic feelings in the US. I have a theory that I think you'll sort of see me really try to explain it and justify it in the book. But I have a theory that that's partly about guilt on some people's part. And if we're talking about white South Africans, even some who will say, things were better under apartheid, this country ran better. What I came to feel is that beneath that, having been at sleepovers or dinner parties or, over a long time with people like that, sometimes that there was much more guilt, that they felt much more guilt and much more shame and much more awareness than they let on of how much privilege they had, of how maybe unjustified it was, how much wealthier they were. And again, these are type of people who would espouse a very shameless public rhetoric. But I don't know if you feel, I'd be interested to hear if you feel that at all about some of the kind of people you've written about. It may be different with politicians who you focus on, but the Americans that you have. But I really came to feel that there was a deep awareness among a really wide range of white South Africans of how much they still owed. to Black South Africans. But this was really, really, really hard to admit for progressives and for conservatives. And so it would lead to either like a blaming of the Black government for kind of ruining everything, because that lets you off the hook. Like if they've ruined everything, then it doesn't really matter that you've been kind of siphoning money from this unequal economy the whole time. And it gave, honestly, in South Africa, I felt it gave to be doomsayers about the country and to constantly talk about how bad things are, gave them a way of like venting a sense that they were very concerned about these issues, which they were much less willing to confront on a personal level or give up, their own wealth. And I think the same can be said here, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. You noted that more liberal, progressive white South Africans have been leaving the new South Africa. More of them than you'd expect are leaving, and far fewer of the ones who supported apartheid are in fact leaving. And there was something poignant in that. I think here again you were drawing a parallel between the United States and South Africa. You wrote, there was the same grief many progressives begin to feel, a worry about being canceled, sneered at, or sidelined, just as their society comes to look much more like what they argued for. So is that what white progressives in America have to look forward to, this notion of feeling sidelined and disenchanted as this multicultural America we've argued for actually emerges? It seems like it felt like a poignant portrayal of the liberal white South Africans' disenchantment that you have.
Yeah, I found liberal white South Africans, with many exceptions, obviously, were extremely disillusioned and had much more of a kind of anti-woke backlash there than even here. Is it what white liberals here have to look forward to? I think they have to, I think white liberals here have to be aware that these are feelings that can occur and watch out for it. Honestly, there were white liberals who had fought really hard for the end of apartheid at a lot of personal cost, actually, because in the 80s, you could be ostracized for opposing apartheid as a white person. And I really subconsciously, and these are not bad people, but they expected more acknowledgement for it in like the history books and the, whatever afterward. And they expected to continue to stand side by side with Black South Africans in designing policy. And, they imagined that they would still be at a vanguard. And they, as allies, they became less necessary once Black people had more power. And this was it's easy to imagine that you will not be in this position and you won't feel that way, but a huge range of people did. And I don't think we're at the stage yet where people are really ready for that, that sidelining that is inevitable. Right.
I think it's something that that we don't even think about here at this stage in the United States. Now, of course, it's a different scenario because the change happens so gradually, because it's less black and white and it is more of a brown majority that is occurring here. So there are many different reasons, but I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about, you see the predictable reactions in our society today, but what you've brought out is many unpredictable consequences and reactions that by definition we can't yet consider. So I would want to encourage people to put their questions in the queue so we can get to those. So please do that now if you're willing to.
Dana, let me ask you, so you are a long time at DC. You kind of stuck it out in DC, where I couldn't. And I mean, was there anything that made you think, and you've just done this book on the Republican Party that also addresses this era in the 90s. I mean, was there anything that you read in the book that reminded you of what you've written about, or reminded you, or made you think differently about the US?
Well, I mean, the parallels, of course, always kept jumping out at me as I read through this. You talked about the conspiracy theories that was happening, I think, from all sides in South Africa, but it was unusually widespread among the white South Africans. That's certainly something we're seeing, particularly from the Trumpy right, but unfortunately we're seeing some of it from the left here as well. You also mentioned that this pervasive sense of victimhood from all sides, and we're certainly seeing that. Everybody right now is feeling aggrieved in the United States. So I was struck mostly by the parallels. I was struck as well by, I think I have a great deal of sympathy for the Trump voter. I have very little sympathy for the politicians who are manipulating, but there is a lot of genuine angst in America right now. And I think you were particularly effective in capturing the nuance of, I believe his name was Christo, the white South African you mentioned. I hope that in what I'm writing about the Trump voters, that I'm making a distinction between the people who are manipulating those people and the genuine disenchantment that they're feeling. That they're, there are very real economic problems that they are reacting to. I think, unfortunately, people have manipulated that into being racial problems. But I think it's important for me to draw that distinction writing about American politics, and I think you are very clearly drawing that distinction in what you wrote about.
Yeah, I mean, it's somebody else used a metaphor with me that South Africa now is like people got put into a car. So it's a car, and then somebody said, fly it. In other words, and you're going like, where's the wings and where's the panels and where's the manual? And it's just like, no, fly it. This has to fly. And what they meant by that metaphor was that it's an economy, it's a almost psychological structure of what we think is the good life, who we look around and we imagine are competent people, this sort of just superstructure that was created for something else. It was created for something that is past, but and now it has to have some other function, but we're sitting in it. And, in South Africa, the other reason that person said that to me was to say, imagine that everyone's fighting in the car. So you have the left and the right, crapping on each other and calling each other horrible names, and Marjorie Taylor Greene's in the car, and that's going to add to the chaos. But if everyone were to calm down and try to work together, it actually doesn't mean that this car is flyable. You have a second order of an issue of really deconstructing kind of long-standing ideas and so on. And there's a kind of grief in South Africa at the realization of just how much the country is still burdened with, even after effectively its civil rights movement. I mean, you would hope that you struggled, you won, you could rest a little bit. And now you have the hardest problem, right?
Yeah,
So,
right. I was struck that you wrote about how the sense that the apartheid regime was giving this great gift, but in fact it was itself going bankrupt, and the gift it gave was in fact a lemon. So essentially putting one over. You a couple of different times in the book you come back to, is it a good news story or is it a bad news story? And of course it's nuanced. It's some of each. But I wonder your view of that. Do you view your take on South Africa as pessimistic?
I think that question's, so I get frustrated with that question. I mean, I understand it. I think it's really, you have to ask what it's anchored to. So, in one sense, the very fact that South Africa has just as much economic inequality as it ever did is kind of a condemnation of the country, and also raises questions for people there about the conciliatory attitudes that were so lauded, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Mandela. How come our country is so far ahead of other countries in terms of economic inequality, but the level of protest is not Sri Lanka, and yet something else is true at the same time, which is that the country was in a civil war, in a kind of low-grade civil war. Its murder rate had no parallel on earth in the early 1990s, and that was political violence. And if one thinks of like the fan of paths that it could have gone on, it's probably like at 80% like good. Like it's just, it could have been way worse. And I sometimes feel, I sometimes feel with the US that there are huge obvious threats that people are talking about, but sometimes against the backdrop of a kind of like unexamined utopianism, an imagination that everything could be good at once, that every group could be happy at once. Nobody's going to feel canceled or forgotten or disempowered, or the economy can work for everyone, and that like if you don't see that outcome, if you can't envision that in reality, you have to be pessimistic about the country. And that also exists in South Africa, but it's something that they talk about more openly, I think, is what is like the best case scenario realistically for our democracy.
Yeah. I often am, I asked you that question because I'm often asked that myself, and it's sort of my stock answer is I'm extremely pessimistic about America in the short run, but
right.
I'm boundlessly optimistic about America in the long run. So maybe I can wish that for the people of South Africa. All right, we've got a question here from Barbara O'Brien. I'm making my first trip to South Africa soon. I'm trying to become more educated about apartheid and its continuing aftermath. I've primarily read Peter Godwin, Rian Milan, Doris Lessig, Nadine Gordimer, and have your book as well, obviously the most important of the bunch.
Thank you.
What else do you recommend an American read to understand the complicated landscape of South Africa?
There's incredible South African poets that one can read. Ingrid Jonker, Donnie Murray, Zekumda. There's, in a way that gives a real kind of flavor of it. You can read South African history books and academic books, and there's a little bit of a texture that you'll miss, I think, because it's really true that the academy has the level of resources in South Africa that means that it's still the case that only certain types of people with certain backgrounds participate in it. But music, there's a genre of music where you can listen to the lyrics called Amapiano, which is so A-M-A and then piano, which I really recommend. I found that before I moved there, things like that gave me a texture of it beyond history books.
Now, you suggested reading some poetry. I would suggest that there's a good bit of poetry in your book here. Did I hear you correctly? You left 400,000 words on the cutting room floor. Did I hear that correctly?
Just about.
Wow. That
I will also say I wrote this book as I actually wrote most of this book on WhatsApp. And I did that for two reasons. I did it because I wanted to have the feeling of it being spoken directly. I wrote it so I lived in Kenya for 2 years, and I wrote it to a friend who's there, who's a newspaper editor, who's very interested in South Africa and kind of has an intermediate level of knowledge. And also because I have a kind of weird theory that people read a lot of stuff on their phones now, and that it actually changes the cadence that we need to use and the type of paragraph. So anyway, I say that to say I hope that you'll find it very readable and very accessible, by which I don't mean dumbed down at all, but just that the stories and the cadences of it may feel a little unusual, but in a nice way, I hope.
So can you talk a bit about the process here? So you wound up writing a political book that's sort of, in the form of almost like a novel or poetic. What were these earlier versions, and why did you decide to do it in this way?
The earlier versions had two qualities. One, they were very focused on one event. So there is an event in this book that is that I really spent years reporting and thinking about and kind of being a little bit in the midst of, and it was the integration and then resegregation of a university, where basically this about 10 years after, well, a little less than that, after 1994, the students they initially really wanted to integrate, and then they kind of chose, in a sense, it's complicated, but to resegregate. And I initially thought, okay, I have a story that's like a microcosm of like paradoxical changes in the country and things that are perplexing and unexpected. And I realized that trying to write about just one person or just one event as your work is peopled with a lot of characters, and that it puts too much burden on that as a kind of an explanation. You end up with a story that's much too neat, and that's just really not real. And then I also tried writing it in a kind of, there's a little bit of a trend in sort of long form reporting that everything has to be investigative and like true crime influenced, and also potentially like you can imagine it as a HBO limited series, and that it has that kind of cinematic feel. And I found that for me, that really I really lost some of the pleasure of writing in that, and writing descriptions and writing my own kind of understandings of what I felt at times people were really trying to say to me underneath their words. If I wrote it where the sort of observer is really absent, and you have these mysteries, and I feel like I don't even know what genre this book is. I mean, it's nonfiction, but is it history? It's kind of...
It's definitely a mixture of the genres. It's very clear you spent an awful lot of time with the characters that you wrote about. You mentioned that there had been some earlier articles where you first met at least some of them. Can you talk about finding them? And you obviously had to gain their trust. People from very different walks of life. Can you talk about those mechanics a bit?
It was also funny. I was encouraged a lot to write about white people, to write about white South Africans, not because of who I am, but I think because of, I don't know, a fascination with kind of backslide and all, and like people, you know, almost wanting to scratch this itch of seeing this reprobate group of whites kind of get even more reprobate and like totally not handle shit, and like and you're like, wow, okay, I'm not like that. And I initially had a kind of layout for the book that had one white and one black character, which again is sort of neat. And then but that was thrown away because it's not true to the reality of the country. It's 85% people of color. So I met Christo. So Christo was the lawyer of some kids who ended up being put on trial for their engagement in this segregation, this resegregation of this university. And I met him. I just was going to write about these kids and this university, and then I went to meet their lawyer. And he sort of said, look, I think I have an insight into their behavior based on this experience in my own life that was both exciting and traumatic, but you're sort of can't say it's traumatic, and also like very evil, but I also honestly had no clue what was happening. And he just, this whole story sort of tumbled out, which even his family didn't know aspects of it, a kind of killing that he was involved in, the fact that he himself had been put on trial as a kind of show trial, right at the end of apartheid, when the government itself was trying to look like they were really white, you know, rounding up the sort of bad whites and cleaning themselves up. So I think that, and he was ambivalent over time, back and forth, about how much of this he wanted known about himself. And initially, because he said he was worried, you know, maybe he could be re-prosecuted, but ultimately he was worried that his buddies would think that he was selling out the white community by revealing some of this complexity. And so we talked a lot about that. But people, because this change happened so fast in South Africa, it was like some people never had a chance to sort of live and like what actually occurred. And so people had they wanted to talk a ton about the 90s, about the 2000s, about what they were experiencing. I then was writing about some students who wanted to take statues down, statues of old white political figures at their universities. And I met the young woman that I ended up talking to a lot, and she was very insistent that I couldn't understand her without meeting her mother. And I was like, okay, but so I ended up driving around with her and her mom, which I wasn't necessarily looking forward to, because I like to interview people one-on-one. And her mother was so incredible that she, in a way, ended up being the main story.
She did, right. Yeah. All right, well, we're nearing the end of the hour here, but I'm going to ask you the question that everybody wants to be asked at the end of this laborious 10-year process. What's the next project?
TBA. But I always had the thought that I would come back to the US, or I did after about maybe a year and a half or 2 years living in South Africa. I felt that I had seen things. I mean, election of Trump maybe surprised me a little less than many of my friends, the election in 2016. And I think that was because of trends and phenomena I'd seen in South Africa. It's another way of looking at a very different, but I mean, a multiracial country that had a history with a ton of parallels to America's, that that was going through quite a turbulent kind of redefining of who gets to say what's moral. And so so I'm really interested now in the US and what that country almost has to say more directly too.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that because your country needs you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dana.
But anyways, I hope that your book is sold far and wide because it's a magnificent work, and I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I've enjoyed talking with you. And Claire, are you with us there?
Thank you both. Thank you so much, Eve, and thank you so much, Dana, for this fantastic and really interesting conversation. Definitely makes me want to read the book. Thank you to all of us out there, all of you out there, for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about and purchase the book on harvard.com or via the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and please be well, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye all.